where you're listening in from. Welcome to our LinkedIn Live session. I'm Apurva. I'm an associate partner with the ESG practice in KPMG in India, and I lead climate change within the practice. I'm joined by my colleagues from KPMG, all three of whom are my mentors in the organization, so it's always a little intimidating to have to quiz them. So we have with us Mike Hayes, who's the Global Head of Climate and Decarbonization in KPMG. We have with us Anish Dey, who's the Global Head for Energy, Natural Resources and Chemicals for KPMG. And we have with us Shivnan Chetty, who's the Head of KPMG's ESG practice in India. So welcome once again, everyone, and I think now we can get started. So maybe what I'll do is start with a bit of context setting before getting reactions from our speakers. The topic of our session today is transitioning to a net zero economy. And whether it's net zero or carbon neutrality, these have all become buzzwords over the past few years. Activities across the world have intensified on climate. In the last few years, we've witnessed a snowballing effect when it comes to the number of public, private, and cross-sector pledges that are being made to convey that intent towards net zero commitments. Today, more than one-third of the world's largest publicly traded companies have already announced net zero targets, and more than 100 companies in India have done the same. If you look at governments across the world, net zero commitments today cover more than 90% of the global GDP and more than 80% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. And while most of these countries have set net zero targets for 2050 or earlier, a number of developing countries and emerging economies like China, India have set targets that go beyond that. India has a 2070 net zero target. And at the COP26 in Egypt, we submitted our long-term emissions development strategy to the UNFCCC with climate justice and sustainable lifestyles as overarching themes, but also more granularly focusing on technology, alternative energy, smart cities, industrial energy efficiency, forestry, amongst other areas. But a common criticism that we have heard over time for all net zero targets across the world is that they're long-term targets. And mid-century is a significant time period away. And does that mean that this option allows companies or countries to postpone reductions to a date that is too far away for comfort? And the response that we have agreed on is that we must absolutely have credible near-term targets that align to this far-away long-term target, because they're both important. And as the IPCC report clearly infers, the world needs near-term targets, for example, to peak GHG emissions before 2025 at the very latest, nearly half GHG emissions by 2030, and in terms of long-term targets, to reach net zero CO2 emissions around mid-century, and by this I mean an average. So some countries will get there sooner and some later. And if you look at the mid-century net zero goals that have been set so far, assuming that they're all achieved, we can expect that warming could be kept to around 1.8 degrees Celsius. And this is what research from my previous organization, the World Resources Institute, says. But many countries across the world and many companies, like I said, across the world are clearly setting what they feel are ambitious goals for themselves in this direction. So with this, and on reflection, sorry, the background setting was a tad bit long, I'd like to turn to Mike. Mike, I know we're lucky to be able to align calendars with you for this session, given the time zones and how much you've been traveling lately all across the world. So I'm curious to know where you're calling in from today.
I'm, for once, I'm calling in from home, which is Dublin, Ireland. Unfortunately, I don't get to spend too much time at home. I've been on the road, particularly I've done 2 trips to Canada in recent times, mainland Europe. So I do get to see a lot of and hear a lot of different perspectives on the net zero agenda across the globe.
That's wonderful. So Ireland is one of the countries I haven't been to within the EU, so it's on my bucket list. But I can imagine that you're pretty much in the thick of things with EU being a frontrunner when it comes to regulations, whether ESG or climate, more broadly. You have the EU Green Deal with the 2050 net zero target. The EU recently announced its green investment package as well, offering tax breaks for businesses investing in net zero technologies. But given what you see across the world in your travels, and not just the EU, do you feel that these are all effective nudges to scale up efforts? And how do you see the sort of landscape evolving in response to these policy signals within your geography?
Well, I'm going to pick up on a variety of different points you've raised in your question and in your introduction. I think, Apurva, we're at a pretty important inflection point generally, and I've come back to the EU and the policy environment because in many ways, policy, technology, and capital are the 3 fundamental bits. And quite often when I talk about those 3 bits, I bring in people as well. But maybe if I could talk first of all about the net zero environment. The reality is that I've seen an evolution over the last 2 years from people starting to talk about net zero set targets, and in more recent times develop climate strategies and roadmaps. And what has changed for me in the last 6 months is very much a focus on implementation. And that's very, very good to see. And one of the drivers of the focus on implementation has been the advent of the transition plan concept. The UK brought it in, first of all, as something that made sense, and there's a requirement under TCFD legislation to report transition plans. But transition plans have gone global in the meantime. Asset managers and financial institutions in particular, specifically those aligned to the GFANZ initiative, are insisting on transition plans, and they're a very good idea because it's an opportunity to find out exactly where a corporation is from the time it's made its target and it start taking action. And I think, I think two things about transition plans. First of all, I think they're a very good thing because it encourages companies to actually start doing something. Anybody can make a commitment. But secondly, Apurva, and probably most importantly, it brings up some of the real challenges we have on the net zero agenda. And I know later in discussion I'll get into those challenges. But we have very real challenges on the agenda, that's for sure. There is a growing consensus that the technology solutions required to get to net zero by 2050, and I balk a little bit about saying 2050 because if you ask me, it's 2040 is becoming the new normal. But we definitely have issues on the technology front. But I think there's a growing realization about just how transformative a decarbonisation strategy is as well. So I will pick this up in our discussion over the course of this podcast. I'm vastly encouraged by the fact that companies are doing it, and short-term targets are less of an issue for the simple reason that companies can pick on the low-hanging fruit, which are things like procuring renewable energy, maybe doing some work on their supply chain, implementing energy efficiency solutions. But ultimately, as you kind of try to get up to the 100% net zero target, that's where it's going to get difficult. So I want to come back then, maybe to really respond to your question about the policy environment and Europe in particular. Now, it's not just Europe. We're seeing policies on climate come in all over the world. And by policies, I mean both the carrot and the stick. The carrot, very good example, is the US Inflation Reduction Act. In Europe, we've got the EU Green Deal, which is full of incentives, but also the policy environment in Europe is very much the stick as well. And one particular policy initiative, which despite lots of resistance globally, lots of uncertainty, is this concept of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, where Europe, in effect, is going to tax high carbon goods, which haven't suffered carbon taxes in other countries, on their importation into the European Union. And again, I'm going to make 2 points. I make 2 points about everything, Apurva. The first point is this is a very significant tax for the industries that are impacted, and the European Union have made it very clear, today it covers things like iron and steel, hydrogen and various other sectors. The European Union have made it clear they're going to extend this to every single sector. That's only the first point. The second point is, and this is the big message for me, it's the degree in which the European Union is prepared to intervene on the low carbon agenda. So yes, we're asking corporations to do everything they can to push along and get to net zero. But if that's not happening, Europe, and I think the US and other countries are doing the same thing, policy is going to play a much, much bigger role, both the carrot and stick approach. CBAM is one example, but the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is, it's a very smart move economically and financially for the US, but also it is helping to drive investment into the newer technologies. And I keep reminding people about the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not just about wind and solar. I'm talking to many entrepreneurs who are developing new what I would call low carbon based solutions, and they're going to avail of the Inflation Reduction Act. So overall message from me, we're on the journey to net zero, lots of challenges ahead, but policy, and particularly where I live in Europe, is going to have a very, very influential role.
Absolutely. And I think that the point you raised on implementation is an important one. And that was the focus of COP26, where we were both last year. And the challenges are very many when it comes to implementation, some common across countries, but also some different given the different developmental stages that we're in across countries. And while EU has also been a frontrunner on implementation so far, I think this ambition is fast sort of expanding across countries. So, for example, while the EU ETS was the first major carbon market in the world and possibly still the largest, today some form of carbon pricing covers more than 40% of global emissions. And there are a lot of new initiatives that sort of intend to scale this coverage, some of which were announced at COP26. And India is also coming up with its own carbon market. And in some part in response to the CBAM that you talked about, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which might be lenient on countries which have their own taxation regimes, and markets are a way of doing that. And in setting up our own markets, I feel that there's so much to learn from EU in terms of designing the market efficiently, given the operational experience that EU has over the years. And we've seen that the design of the market is typically a sticking point when it comes to trade in the first few cycles of any ETS. So maybe quickly turning to Shiva, would you like to reflect on how the carbon markets are shaping up in India and what corporates can expect in the near future?
Before I move into the carbon market, just to add to what Mike has said, we are already seeing leading Indian companies actually setting up their net zero target ranging from 2035 to 2050, despite the fact that India as a country has committed to 2070. So we are already seeing that market pressure working on leading Indian companies. So I'm sure there would be a lot of other Indian companies who would be setting their target aligned to what's happening in Europe, around 2050 or 2040. Mike was talking about. Coming back to the carbon markets, Apurva, you would have already seen India. India already has developed institutional capacity in terms of carbon market. We have renewable energy certificate schemes, and we have perform, achieve, and trade program, which has been active for last 1 decade. And India has been very active in the clean development mechanism, the CDM as we called it, and India was one of the leading suppliers of carbon credit into the global market, especially UETS. So there is an institutional capacity that is already existing within India. And in December last year, we saw Indian Parliament actually passing an energy conservation, which is an amendment bill, which basically empowered the government to establish carbon market and introduce carbon credit trading scheme. And also in February this year, the government announced a list of 13 activities, basically, that would be considered for trading of carbon credits under Article 6.2, basically to facilitate the transfer of emerging technologies from developed countries and mobilize international finance into India. So this actually provides a good starting point for implementing carbon markets in India. Having said that, having a national carbon market in India linked to the developed markets like EU ETS, they will definitely help to bring down the marginal emission abatement cost curve, as we have seen earlier in case of CDM, where the carbon credit was being priced at 20 euros as compared to the EU ETS, which was multiples of that. So definitely, in terms of carbon markets, India can actually be which would play an important role at the global level.
Thanks, Shiva. I think I agree that there's a lot we can build in terms of institutional capacity, given our experience with the clean development mechanism. But also on a slightly pessimistic note, that we can observe today that despite all of these efforts, despite all of the ambitious policy signals, evolving regulations that you talked about and Mike talked about across the world, today research shows that we're still not aligned to a 1.5 degree pathway, and collectively across the world. So whether you look at the emissions gap report or the IPCC 6 assessment report, there's no doubt that that window is fast closing in terms of near-term actions, and that needs to be quite urgent in the way that we respond. Recent research also shows that if you look at the updated NDCs that countries across the world have submitted, it's probably closer to a 2.4 to 2.8 degrees in terms of where we're headed. So we're still falling short by a considerable margin, and the point is that it's only urgently implemented system-wide transformations that could put us back on track in alignment with the Paris Agreement pathways. So whether it's the power sector, whether it's transportation, whether it's heavy industry, or even how we grow our food and what we eat. We need to be able to transformatively sort of decarbonize every aspect of the economy. So my question to you, Anish, is given the enormity of this challenge and the unprecedented nature of this challenge, what are some of the key enablers and levers in terms of finance and technology that we can deploy today to scale up efforts, including within the hard-to-abate sectors?
Okay, thanks, Apurva. And I'll first comment on that 1.5 degree point. And I speak to CEOs across the world, and we hosted recently a CEO conclave for the petrochemical industry globally. And it's very clear that nobody believes, the business community leaders don't believe that 1.5 degrees is doable. Everybody is looking at, doing it, living on a 2 degrees plus world. Sad as it is, it seems to be the reality. And it kind of aligns with what you're saying, that even with the NDCs, you're not anywhere close to 2 degrees, you're well above 2 degrees. So that's the reality which we have to live with. And I think it is important to understand that we have to, in some sense, while we go on our net zero journeys, look at technology, look at finance, everything, but we definitely have to think of strategies which will align with the emerging reality as we look at, which is beyond 2 degrees. And I think it doesn't reduce the need for acting with urgency. Even if we act with urgency, that's possibly the scenario we're looking at. And if I sound overly pessimistic, I don't have a climate and climate policy background. I have an energy background, and my energy background brings me squarely there. Also because, if you see globally, more than 80% of current energy is still met by fossil fuels. That's the reality today. And when we are talking of a massive transition, it is a transition, not a switch. And to that extent, I think we need to be, careful about what we set our expectations around. Now, having said that, as I said, we must do everything that we can. And technology levers are emerging. Some of them, like hydrogen, came in with a lot of promise. I think I can see a little bit of backpedaling around that a little bit because people, it was supposed to be the silver bullet. People are recognizing that it's not a silver bullet. The demand side is not necessarily completely prepared for that. We are also seeing emphasis on CCS and CCUS. I think progressively as we go forward, we are seeing much more developments in CCUS, the utilization part of which hasn't scaled as yet, but I think there are great promises which are coming. So sustainable aviation fuel, which is essentially a byproduct of CCUS, we're going to see action around that. And I'm confident that some of those things are, as they scale, they will become, competitive. So I think that is there. But the biggest hope I have is on energy efficiency. And this honestly has never been the top level agenda. It's never been our CEO agenda. It's been somewhere, not even a sustainability manager. It's been the line managers, prerogative, so to speak. And that is getting elevated to a CEO agenda. And what we have seen, just in terms of statistics, if we really have to be on the net zero track, which I think is very difficult, we have to kind of look at energy intensity coming down by to half. Okay, and that come only on work on the demand side, not on the supply side. And I think the point which Shiva was mentioning, markets will play a role. Markets will play a role through different kinds of projects, but it includes those demand side projects which will be critical. So my hope is that we are going to see breakthrough technologies on the demand side, which is relatively unexplored. And we are going to see a lot of things rather than putting all my hopes on the supply side, which I think will evolve, but not at the pace which we hope that it will, or to deliver those kinds of results.
Thanks, Anish.
Could I add?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Could I add to that, Apurva? But so exactly as Anish said, the energy part of this is really important, and because of some of the issues we identified earlier, I would say in the last 6 months I was at COP27 in Egypt, but more particularly at Davos in January in Switzerland, and I know it's top of the agenda for COP28 in Dubai. Energy transition is now seen as absolutely critical. But I want to go back to my first love, renewable energy. There's so much we can do if we figure out how to scale renewable energy properly and how to store it. And there are efforts, particularly in the European Union, to reduce the timelines for development of renewable energy projects. So it's a very good example of where policy can play a role again to help accelerate some of these really important industries to help us get there. But, as Anisha said, we're still driven by fossil fuel energy sources, and the sooner we enable that through technology development and through policy to switch to other sources, but particularly renewables, I think we'll be in a better place.
Thanks, Anish and Mike. I agree. I think when it comes to technology, especially when you look at the hard-to-abate sectors as well, the challenge in the near term is particularly complex. I would say both on the demand and supply side. And by this I mean the industries that primarily rely on fossil fuels, either for aside from the electricity for high temperature heat purposes or for feedstocks such as the cement sector, steel or fertilizer and refineries, because they would need to structurally change the way that they operate, whether it's their technology or their processes. Similarly, for other sort of heavy-duty transportation, such as trucks and shipping or aviation or maritime that you touched upon. But technologies aren't necessarily available today commercially to be able to drive up that uptake in the near term, perhaps more in the medium term. And Anishi also talked about hydrogen and CCUS. And for this very reason, many companies have their hands tied when it comes to the near term, because it's still, until a sort of reasonable greenium develops for green or climate friendly products, they're looking at a medium to a long term time scale to be able to decarbonize. And this sort of brings up the whole question also around accountability and transparency. So big criticism of corporate climate goals today is the lack of these interim milestones. The fact that it might be too long, time frame for that target, for a goal that the company has aligned itself to, or that the goal covers just a few emission categories or a smaller part of the supply chain, or perhaps that the strategy is too reliant on offsetting or more recently even insetting. And so this makes company-wide net zero targets very difficult to compare. And this is where organizations like the SBTi, the Science Based Targets Initiative, have done great work in firstly sort of translating the global goals to company levels, but also enhancing comparability and alignment. But there's still a lot of concern that remains in terms of greenwashing, transparency, and accountability. So given this increasing focus, and we saw that at the COP2 last year, my question to you, Shiva, is, do you agree with me when I say that MRV is very important from the perspective of building trust and transparency? And if so, how can companies strengthen their MRVs, improve their disclosures as part of their commitments, or how might even governments enforce measures at preventing greenwashing? Perhaps you might want to reflect from the Indian perspective as well.
So, of course, MRV is pretty critical for building that trust and transparency. When the performance data has to be reported, especially to the stakeholders like regulators, investors, and clients, basically. And it can definitely have a both financial as well as reputational impact when your stakeholders are regulators and you're reporting it for the tax purposes. We're talking about topics like CBAM here. And with the advent of data and digital and applications and technology like IoT, AI data capture and monitoring has become much more simpler as compared to earlier, where people have been using Excel sheet or undertaking manual calculations. Now, standardized methodologies are available. Of course, not in many cases. Yes, it is difficult, especially for complex projects like land use, land cover, forestry. It is challenging and it is still evolving. But for the industrial emission calculation, there are standard methodologies are available. Emission factors are available. And one of the important element out here is independent assurance, which is pretty critical actually. And it's important for the companies to ensure and choose verifiers who have the expertise and the experience. That's it's very important to understand the gaps in their estimation and reporting, because we have seen with several companies there has been cases of double count or using emission factors. Those are old and they haven't looked at the new factors that have come out. And it's important for the companies also to look at reasonable assurance, and especially when you're looking at GHG emission for that matter.
Thanks, Shiva. Absolutely. And it's interesting that you touched on assurance, because that is also part of SEBI's evolving guidelines within India as well on disclosure. And the way that I see it, I think across the world, as these regulations evolve, and with initiatives like the ISSB, which aim to sort of standardize these disclosures, that will eventually lead to sort of a global set of climate disclosures that will affect most or all companies across the world, either as parent companies or as part of the supply chains of bigger companies. But talking about disclosures, this whole concept of double materiality is fast emerging. So while so far companies looked at how climate change affects companies and their competitiveness, double materiality essentially requires that you analyze how the activities of the company affect the environment and communities as well. So essentially, how are you responding to stakeholders that are not your shareholders? And this brings me to my next question for Mike. We understand today in many ways that social is intrinsically linked to climate as well. and several emerging initiatives, global and national, are aimed at ensuring that we plan our transition in a way that is fair to all, and which is what we call just transition in our parlance. So an example of this is the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation that we are founding members of, as you know. So because we know that the big challenge today is that the low carbon transition can disproportionately impact certain communities, regions, and industries more than others, and this will ensure that the transition is fair, inclusive, and creates work opportunities that are decent. But how do we operationalize this principle, I think, is the biggest challenge today. Would you agree, and how do you see this space evolving?
So I think you raise a really important point, Apurva. People started off from this broad ESG concept, and the reality is everybody's got a different definition of what ESG is. But the E, S, and G have actually started to evolve initially independently, and now they're coming together. I mean, the governance part of this has always been important, long before you and I started talking about ESG, and it's probably a part of this agenda that doesn't get enough attention, because you've mentioned greenwashing a couple of times, and there's big issues at a corporate board level. Everybody understands the importance of E, but what's been happening in recent times is the S and E are coming together. And in particular, like you mentioned, just transition, I'm also going to mention supply chains. And the reality is, as we embark and work with our clients on decarbonisation journeys, trying to implement strategies which in many times involve setting up new projects, or getting, particularly for energy solutions, getting energy developers to establish new projects and doing work in various initiatives to shut down fossil fuel projects, particularly coal plants. The reality is that is hurting some communities. And I'm older than I look, Apurva, and I go back to the coal mines in the UK in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher, who was the then Prime Minister of the UK, tried to shut down coal mines, and she succeeded. But the social disruption that caused has left a mark in those societies to the current day. Roll forward to where we are today in 2023, and we're actually starting to see the same thing arise. We're seeing the advent of communities and employees reacting to the drive to low carbon solutions. And in some countries in the world, I'd look to India, but particularly in Australia, in South Africa, and a couple of other countries, you cannot contemplate a new low carbon project today without addressing just energy concerns. So you have to think about the impact on whether you're displacing some other fossil fuel plant. Are you going to give jobs to those people? What impact it has on the local community, and as well as that, and just tangentially bring up another topic, Apurva, the impact on the nature and biodiversity world as well has come into it. So just transition considerations are coming to the fore. I don't think yet we have sufficient clarity to work with investors and energy companies to actually tell them specifically how they should deal with this. And this is what this Alliance for Just Energy Transformation that you and I and others are involved with, it's really to develop some principles, guidelines, and ultimately frameworks to help us embed these type of social considerations into the work we're doing on energy transition. But as I said at the outset, the supply chain part is equally important. We are doing a lot of work on the carbon agenda to reduce Scope 3 emissions. We're looking at, all of the different, what I would call categories under Scope 3, and seeing how we can tackle them. But we can't do that without thinking about the social issues as well, the human rights issues, particularly longer supply chains. And that's a very good example, together with the just transition example, of where the S&E have come together, and we shouldn't be thinking of them independently. So in conclusion, I would say, Apurva, it's one more challenge, one more thing to think about. And my overall position is that we are transforming not just projects or businesses, we're transforming society on this drive to net zero. And the sooner we really think about it in those kind of macro terms, the better, because we have to wake up to the fact that we're at war. It's a different type of war, but it's every bit as serious.
Thanks, Mike. I think I agree that the coal challenge is a very big one, even in countries like ours. But even beyond this, when we talk about social, I think there are multiple challenges when it comes to corporates, even beyond the shift from coal. And that's what we've been noticing increasingly today. For example, land acquisition and diversion. Land is a finite resource. So we're having to explore the land, water, energy, food nexus more deeply today. given that, in countries like ours where land is scarce, it's often productive land that is diverted from either forest or agricultural use to set up even clean energy facilities, right? Or, for example, job creation and job losses beyond coal, for example, in the electric vehicle value chain, or for that matter, even in agriculture. If you talk about biofuels, which again, there's a huge impetus on biofuels in India, again, this land energy nexus becomes quite important. Or whether when we talk about supply chain, companies should be able to ask tough questions around where the materials are coming from, and if they're holding their suppliers accountable for, say, human rights issues. So I agree. I think it's a huge set of challenges, and coal is probably the biggest one.
And actually, in Europe, to be fair, I only learned this recently, but under CSRD reporting, which goes into not just carbon, it goes into water, climate, circularity, and nature. You also have to report under pollution. So think of the modern corporation with all of the different challenges. It can be quite overwhelming, and that's why this is going to be a bit of a struggle over the next 5 to 10 years to really embark to try to get to net zero.
Absolutely. I think these are all very sort of important questions also when it comes to double materiality, the concept that I mentioned before, because this is a very important point you raised in terms of biodiversity and nature. So while this was not a topic of widespread conversation in the past when talking about the low carbon transition, we can see trends emerge today that demonstrate this intrinsic link, right? Biodiversity is declining at an alarming rate, we know that, and in part due to climate change, which broadly falls under the domain of adaptation, but it's also contributed in major part due to habitat loss or overexploitation. And this is in part dependent on the trade-offs in the way we decide to grow. For example, in renewables, our journey started in India with much smaller wind farms on smaller land holdings that were environmentally benign, to today like mega-sized solar and wind farms that can, potentially entail huge diversion of tracts of land, whether it's unproductive land or even forest land or agricultural land that can impact biodiversity. And I think this is where the need for strategic planning also comes in, and also where the deployment of nature-based solution comes in. So on this specifically, on whoever wants to reflect, and maybe Shiva, you might like to start, how can nature-based solutions play an important role in our net zero journey? And how can we sort of reduce that impact on biodiversity as an allied question to that?
Sure, probably I'll just go first. Of course, NBS or nature-based solution provides multiple benefits, cross-sectoral benefits, and can help enhance the natural capital by replenishing the natural resources that are important for achieving food, water, and energy security, urban resilience, protection of biodiversity, and restoration of habitats, to just name a few. I think it is very important from an Indian perspective because India is one of the most top 5 most vulnerable country in the world in terms of climate change impact, and it will help. NBS does help India both in mitigation as well as resilience. Mitigation in terms of creating carbon sink, and also create resilience in sectors like agriculture, which is one of the most vulnerable in terms of impact from climate change. As a country, India has committed to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 million tons of CO2 equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030, which means that it has to increase the forest cover from 25% we're currently to 33% and restoring to 26 million hectares land by 2030, which is quite huge. And also, the government of India has launched the Green India Mission and National Afforestation Program, which is actually creating a incentive for companies to undertake this initiative in the ESG as well as CSR program. We have seen diverse sectors like IT actually taking up this program as a part of their ESG or CSR initiative. And it was pretty interesting last week in a discussion where one of the leading top IT company in the world is actually talking about urban biodiversity, and they have got programs in the cities in India, but they are talking about working on some of the extinct species through urban biodiversity program, which is pretty interesting.
Thanks, Shiva. And I agree that biodiversity and nature are very from the Indian context, given how blessed we are in terms of biodiversity. But maybe coming back to challenges more broadly, and we covered a lot of ground already. But given how complex this low carbon journey is is sort of proving to be already. In closing, and this is a question to everyone, what would you say is that one big complexity that corporates or even governments need to maneuver today in order to scale up the transition? And how can we work around a solution? So some quick sort of closing reflections from each speaker would be great because I'm mindful of time. So Anish, do you want to go first and then Mike and Shiva?
Yeah. Finally, I get my chance. Yes. So yes, I will. And I think the key point is that, different nations are very different in their journeys. And India in particular is something which is a very, very different point. It's a very large economy. And by, say, 2070, 75, it will possibly become the second largest economy in the world. And you can't control this growth. This is something which is pent up requirements, pent up demand. The demographics are going to drive this, and so on. So I think this is a real tightrope walk for countries like India. And even if you want to, it's not so easy to get off coal. I mean, we'll talk about coal transition later. First, we have to get energy. We can't walk into energy poverty. Okay, that's, I'll quote Mahatma Gandhi. He said that the poverty is the worst form of violence. Okay, and if we have energy poverty, we end up in that violence. But at the same time, I think if you look at everything else, if you still have coal unabated emissions on that scale, you will have challenges around that, which will again dispossess the most people on the margins of society. So I think, and from a public policy standpoint, it's not a choice that you make between energy and the other forms of security of other kinds. It's both of them have to be had. And this is where I think, I started with the technology point, but I think that's also, where we have to look at and to stay positive. I think this technology development is happening at an amazing pace. We don't have all the answers. We shouldn't imagine that today's today's technology solutions are going to work for the future. We just need to stay invested that there is an enormous amount of innovation happening if you travel to various parts of the world, and particularly in India. The amount of innovation which is happening is phenomenal. So we just need to stay course on that, keep faith, be sensitive, be kind, make sure that, we are carrying people along. The double materiality becomes very important, and then soldier on, with full consciousness that we don't have all the solutions. The other thing which I think is super important is that we need to use digital technologies much more effectively because, Shiva talked about MRV. But MRV is one kind. You actually can make massive amounts of transformation using both the operational technologies and digital technologies much more effectively. I think that's a space to explore. We haven't explored that space enough.
Thanks, Anish. But you talked about technology, but do you think that with reference to technology, geopolitics could also be one of the bigger emerging challenges globally?
See, geopolitics is a constant challenge. It's never gone away. And honestly speaking, we have to take it as a part of the normal. Those will be shocks which will come at various times. And my own sense is that as the climate change challenges become worse, we are going to see even more of those challenges. Now, if we take a little more time, I'll tell you, I was in the Middle East for one of my travels. And there we are seeing two recognitions came out back with me sharply, three actually. The first is that there is recognition in that world that there is climate change is real and they need to contribute to what they can to do decarbonize their operations. The second realization which also came is that, they know that oil and gas is not going away anywhere in a hurry because, as I said, 80% of the energy is coming and the needle is not moving fast enough towards clean energy. So you have to serve the world with energy and they know that. But the third aspect, what I realized coming out of this, including this recent cut in OPEC production proposed from May, is that these are all interlinked. Geopolitics is intricately interlinked with that. So geopolitical shocks and dynamics will continue to play out in different forms across the world. We have to take it as a new norm.
Thanks, Anish. Mike and Shiva, any quick reflections from your side on challenges?
Yeah, so agree with what Anisha said, but the other big thing for me in practice, and it's almost a lead on from the double materiality concept, is the cost of decarbonisation. So yes, you can do reporting on the societal impacts of what you're doing. That's great. But today, investors are saying to companies, you're spending X amount of millions implementing and allocating capital to decarbonisation solutions. Tell me what that does to the value of my interest in your corporation. And that is a very significant challenge on the horizon because the ambition is great, implementing solutions and particularly the easy solutions is fantastic. but we're now at the inflection point around the cost of decarbonisation, and we need to develop a narrative to say, in the long run, this is not just good for the world, good for climate, which is what it should be about. We need to prove to our stakeholders that this is good for business as well.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And you talked about the cost of decarbonization. That's interesting because research shows that climate finance will need to multiply by to 3 to 6 times by 2030 just to achieve the mitigation goals. And even that current finance that's already been mobilized is quite unfairly distributed. And I think this was also a question that was, and a very common issue that was raised by several countries in the COP last year, was the fact that the cost of capital is at such odds with the potential for decarbonization across countries. And that's a major challenge today, right? Like, while so much of the investment is being made in developed countries, developing countries that have the largest potential to decarbonize aren't necessarily receiving the support that they need. So I think that's a very important point. But Shiva, any quick reflection from your side?
I mean, in terms of climate change risk, India definitely, it's a significant risk to Indian economy. It's a major risk. Having said that, we are in a unique position where India is just at the just beginning to grow its economy, and we are at the initial stage, and we are in a situation where we have to deploy technology, and this is the best time where we can leverage on the opportunities. Of course, risk is there. We need to mitigate that risk. As Anish said, we can't walk away from coal, and there has been quite an intense debate where India spoke about bringing down the coal consumption rather than committing to stop it, and we set up a decarbonization target by 2070. But having said that, I feel that this is the best time for India to come out with green policies and leverage on the big market opportunities that are opening up.
Thanks, Shiva. And I agree that each of these challenges is quite complex in its own way, whether it's technology or finance or even data for that matter. And I think that with recent developments like the Ukraine conflict or the rising commodity prices, that's kind of shaken everyone up to say that we must end this dependency on fossil fuels, even if for countries like ours it might be a sort of phase-wise approach, like you said, Shiva, that we may not be able to end coal right away, but we must end this dependency over the long term. Because even aside from what it's doing to the climate, clean energy is great from the energy security standpoint. Sometimes the co-benefits actually outweigh even the climate considerations. So completely agree. And with this, I'd just like to wrap up now. This conversation has been so interesting. Thank you to all of the speakers. I don't feel like ending it, but I suppose all good things might come to an end. And I know that I can pick your brains in office anytime, like I do. But for those who are watching us right now, if you'd like to speak to us further, pick our brains further, do engage with us on social media, or we can find ways to collaborate. So with this, we can now come to a close, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Apurva.